A cruel woman humiliated her wheelchair-bound millionaire husband in front of everyone without mercy. She mocked his chair, his slowness, his life, as if it were part of the dinner. But everything stopped when the waitress's daughter screamed in the middle of the hall. It was in that scream that the greatest turning point that Elite had ever seen began. The crystal chandeliers of Le Petit Manhattan cast their elegant glow over tables draped in pristine white linen, each one positioned with military precision across the polished marble floor. Richard Harrison adjusted his platinum cufflinks and glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, the subtle weight of his custom-made wheelchair barely registering as he navigated through the restaurant's opulent dining room. 7:30 sharp, just as Victoria had demanded in her text that morning. Always punctual, always composed, always the picture of refined wealth that Manhattan's elite expected from a Harrison. The maître d', Pierre, approached with practiced deference, his movements fluid, as he guided Richard to their usual table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The autumn leaves painted a golden tapestry against the darkening sky, a view that once filled Richard with wonder, but now served merely as expensive wallpaper for another obligatory evening with his wife. "Monsieur Harrison, will Madame be joining you shortly?" Pierre inquired, his French accent as authentic as his perfectly pressed tuxedo. "She'll be here," Richard replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built his empire, but now felt hollow in personal conversations. "The usual table setting, please." As Pierre disappeared into the bustling kitchen, Richard's eyes wandered across the dining room, taking in the familiar faces of New York's social aristocracy. The Weatherbys held court at table 12, their animated discussion of their latest acquisition undoubtedly masking some scandal involving their wayward son. Near the bar, the Ashfords whispered conspiratorially with the Blackwells, their perfectly coiffed heads bent together like plotting ravens in designer clothing. This was Victoria's domain, this gilded cage of appearances and calculated conversations, where every gesture carried meaning and every smile concealed a dagger. Richard had once been charmed by her ability to navigate these treacherous social waters, but 15 years of marriage had shown him the true cost of admission to her world. The accident 3 years ago had only made the price more apparent. His wheelchair, a masterpiece of German engineering worth more than most people's cars, drew the usual mixture of sympathy and discomfort from the other diners. Some nodded respectfully, others averted their eyes, but all of them saw it before they saw him. Victoria had made that abundantly clear during their last public appearance together. The soft rustle of expensive fabric announced her arrival before he saw her. Victoria Harrison swept into the restaurant like a queen claiming her throne, her emerald Hermes dress flowing around her like liquid silk. Every head turned to watch her progress across the room, her honey-blonde hair cascading over one shoulder in perfect waves that had cost $300 at the salon that afternoon. She paused at the Weatherby table, air-kissing Margaret's powdered cheeks while delivering some perfectly timed compliment about her jewelry. Then, another stop at the Ashfords, where her crystalline laugh cut through the ambient noise like fine wine poured into crystal glasses. Every pause, every gesture, every word was calculated to reinforce her position as Manhattan's reigning social queen. Finally, after establishing her royal progress for all to witness, Victoria glided to their table, her smile as perfectly applied as her makeup. She settled into her chair with practiced grace, crossing her legs at precisely the angle that would showcase her $1,000 shoes, while maintaining an air of effortless elegance. "Richard, darling," she said, her voice honey-sweet, but with an undertone as sharp as winter wind. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting. The traffic from the gallery was simply impossible." "Of course not," Richard replied, though his watch indicated she was 23 minutes late. Punctuality had never been one of Victoria's virtues, unless it served her purposes. A young woman approached their table, her movements nervous but determined. Sarah Martinez had been working at Le Petit Manhattan for 8 months, long enough to recognize the Harrisons as both generous tippers and demanding customers. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun required by management, and her hands trembled slightly as she placed the evening's wine menu on their table. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying a faint accent that spoke of childhood summers in Puerto Rico with her grandmother. "May I start you with something to drink this evening?" Victoria's green eyes swept over Sarah with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing prey. "The usual for my husband," she said without looking. Up from her phone, where she was scrolling through social media with practiced boredom. "And I'll have a Veuve Clicquot, but make sure it's properly chilled. Last week's champagne was practically room temperature." Sarah nodded quickly, making notes on her small pad. "Of course, Mrs. Harrison, I'll have the sommelier check the temperature personally." As Sarah hurried away, Victoria's attention shifted to her husband, with the same clinical detachment she might reserve for examining a piece of furniture. "You look tired, darling," she observed, her tone suggesting this was somehow a personal failing on his part. "Perhaps you should consider reducing your hours at the foundation. All that charity work must be exhausting." The Harrison Foundation had been Richard's passion project since the accident, using his technology fortune to improve accessibility in public spaces across the city. It was one of the few things that still brought him genuine satisfaction, but Victoria had always viewed it as an inconvenient hobby that interfered with their social obligations. "The work is important, Victoria," Richard said quietly, his fingers tracing the rim of his water glass. "The City Council is finally listening to our recommendations for the subway accessibility project." "How noble," Victoria replied, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Though I do wonder if all this advocacy work is really the best use of your time. The Blackwells were asking about you at the Met Gala last month. They seemed concerned about your absence from proper society events." Across the restaurant, 7-year-old Emma Martinez sat quietly in the corner booth reserved for staff families, her coloring book spread across the small table as she worked diligently on a picture of a princess in a pink dress. Her mother had explained that she needed to be very quiet and very good while the grown-ups ate their fancy dinner, and Emma was determined to live up to that responsibility. She held an invisible tray in her small hands, practicing the graceful movements she'd watched her mother perform hundreds of times. Left hand supporting, right hand guiding, always keep the glasses from touching. Emma's game was interrupted when she heard a familiar voice rising above the gentle murmur of dinner conversation. "Really, Richard, you must stop dwelling on limitations," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the dining room. "I know the situation is challenging, but there's no reason to make it everyone else's problem. The Weatherbys invited us to their yacht party in the Hamptons, and I simply couldn't explain why we can't attend. What would I tell them? That my husband can't manage the gangplank?" Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I can manage fine, Victoria, but I'm not interested in pretending everything is normal just to maintain appearances." "Normal?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "Darling, nothing about our situation is normal, but that doesn't mean we have to advertise it to everyone. People are beginning to talk, you know, about how you've become so withdrawn, so focused on these wheelchair ramps and elevator buttons. It's becoming rather tedious." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible to anyone who cared to look, but ignored by the polite society that had learned to overlook inconvenient truths. The other diners continued their conversations, their trained ears selecting which words to hear and which to dismiss. But Emma Martinez heard everything. She frowned at her coloring book, her small hand pausing over a purple crayon as she processed what the pretty lady had said. In her 7-year-old world, being mean to someone because they used a wheelchair seemed as silly as being mean to someone for wearing glasses or having brown hair. Sarah returned with their drinks, setting them down with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. Victoria took a sip of her champagne and immediately made a face. "This is still too warm," she announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Do you people not understand the basic requirements of proper service? I specifically asked for it to be properly chilled." Sarah's face flushed red, but she maintained her professional composure. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Harrison. I'll have the sommelier replace it immediately." "See that you do," Victoria replied, dismissing Sarah with a wave of her manicured hand. "And perhaps next time you might consider actually listening when a customer gives you specific instructions." As Sarah hurried back to the bar, Victoria turned her attention back to Richard, her green eyes glittering with a dangerous light. "Now then, about the Weatherby party. I've already told Margaret we'll be there, so I do hope you won't make me look foolish by changing your mind at the last minute." Again. Richard's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles, white with suppressed tension. 15 years of marriage had taught him to recognize the warning signs when Victoria was building toward one of her public displays, but he'd never found an effective way to diffuse them. "I haven't changed my mind about anything," he said carefully, "but I won't pretend to enjoy watching you perform for an audience that sees me as your unfortunate burden." "Burden?" Victoria's voice rose just enough to carry to the neighboring tables, where conversations began to slow as ears turned toward their drama. "Richard, really, you're being so dramatic. No one sees you as a burden. They simply see you as different now. Less vital, less dynamic. It's perfectly natural that people would be curious about how we're adapting." The word adapting fell from her lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort across the nearby tables. Even by Victoria's standards, this was becoming pointed enough to make their audience uncomfortable. Emma Martinez looked up from her coloring book, her brown eyes wide with confusion. She'd been raised to believe that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of, that everyone deserved kindness, regardless of how they moved through the world. The pretty lady's words didn't make sense in Emma's universe of fair play and basic decency. Victoria continued, her voice gaining confidence as she sensed her audience's attention. "I mean, darling, we must be realistic about these things. There are simply some activities that are no longer practical for us. Dancing, for instance, it would be rather awkward to explain to people why we can't join them on the dance floor. How does one dance with someone who's confined to wheels?" The restaurant fell almost silent. The only sounds the distant clatter of kitchen preparations and the soft jazz playing through. Hidden speakers. Even the waitstaff had slowed their movements, their trained instincts warning them that they were witnessing something that would be discussed in hushed tones for months to come. Richard's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Confined," he repeated quietly. "Is that how you see me, Victoria? Confined? Well, aren't you?" Victoria's smile was brilliant and poisonous, like a beautiful snake preparing to strike. "I mean, let's not pretend otherwise. The Richard Harrison who built an empire, who commanded boardrooms, who swept me off my feet at the Met Gala 15 years ago. That man could do anything. This man," she gestured vaguely toward his wheelchair, "this man needs help getting up curbs." Emma Martinez stood up suddenly, her coloring book forgotten as something inside her chest burned with an unfamiliar feeling. She'd never felt anger quite like this before, hot and righteous and demanding action. Without thinking about consequences or propriety, or the fact that she was a 7-year-old girl in a room full of powerful adults, she picked up her small cup of water from her table. The dining room seemed to hold its breath as Emma walked across the marble floor, her sneakers, silent against the polished stone. She moved with the determined purpose of childhood innocence, unaware that she was about to shatter the carefully constructed world of Manhattan's social elite. "Excuse me," Emma said politely, appearing beside Victoria's chair like a small guardian angel with righteous fury in her eyes. Victoria looked down at the child with surprise and irritation, clearly annoyed at having her performance interrupted by staff family. "Yes? What do you want?" Emma's answer came not in words but in action. She raised her small cup with careful precision, the same way she'd watched her mother handle countless glasses and plates, and poured the entire contents directly into Victoria Harrison's perfectly styled face. The water hit Victoria like a slap, soaking through her $1,000 makeup and dripping from her honey-blonde hair onto her emerald Hermes dress. For a moment the restaurant existed in perfect silence, as if the universe itself was processing what had just occurred. Then Victoria began to scream. The silence that followed Victoria's screams seemed to stretch for eternity, though it lasted only seconds. Water dripped from her face onto the pristine white tablecloth, creating dark circles that spread like ripples of consequence across the expensive fabric. Her emerald dress, moments before a testament to her refined taste, now clung uncomfortably to her shoulders, and her perfectly applied makeup ran in streaks down her cheeks. Emma stood beside the table, her empty cup still in her small hands, looking up at the chaos she had created, with the wide-eyed confusion of a child who had acted on pure instinct. She hadn't planned this moment, hadn't calculated its impact or considered its consequences. She had simply seen cruelty and responded with the only power available to her. "You little brat!" Victoria shrieked, her voice cutting through the restaurant like a knife through silk. She leaped to her feet, her chair scraping against the marble floor as champagne bubbles fizzed angrily in her abandoned glass. "How dare you? Where are your parents? Someone needs to control this child." The dining room erupted into nervous whispers as Manhattan's elite processed this unprecedented breach of their sacred social order. Margaret Weatherby clutched her pearls, literally, while her husband Harold reached for his phone to document the scandal. The Ashfords exchanged meaningful glances that promised weeks of delicious gossip, and the Blackwells leaned forward in their chairs like vultures sensing carrion. Pierre, the maitre d', appeared as if summoned by supernatural forces, his face pale with the knowledge that his career might not survive whatever was about to unfold. Behind him, Sarah Martinez rushed forward, her face flushed with horror as she realized her daughter was at the center of the commotion. "Emma!" Sarah gasped, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harrison. She's just a child. She doesn't understand. Doesn't understand." Victoria's voice rose to a pitch that made crystal glasses vibrate sympathetically. "She assaulted me, in front of everyone. This is unacceptable, completely unacceptable." She turned, her fury on Pierre. "I want this woman fired immediately, tonight, and I want them both removed from this establishment." Pierre's hands fluttered nervously as he tried to process the situation. The Harrisons were important customers, members of the restaurant's exclusive patron circle, whose monthly spending could fund a small business. But they were also witnessing something that felt bigger than a simple customer service dispute. "Perhaps," Pierre began carefully, "we could discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss," Victoria snapped, water still dripping from her hair. "This employee has clearly failed to control her offspring, and I refuse to tolerate this kind of behavior. Fire her now." Emma looked up at her mother, confusion and fear beginning to replace the righteous anger that had driven her to act. She didn't understand why the pretty lady was so angry about a little water when she had been saying such mean things to the nice man in the wheelchair. In Emma's world, mean people deserved to get splashed. "I didn't mean to be bad," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of conversation from other tables. "She was being mean to him." "Being mean?" Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You presumptuous little creature. You have no idea what you're talking about. That's my husband, and our private conversation is none of your business." Richard Harrison had remained silent throughout the confrontation, his face a mask of controlled emotion as he watched his wife's public meltdown. But something in Emma's simple declaration pierced through years of practiced numbness. A 7-year-old child had seen what an entire restaurant full of sophisticated adults had chosen to ignore. "Victoria," Richard said quietly, his voice cutting through her tirade like a blade through paper. "Stop. Stop." Victoria whirled to face him, her green eyes blazing with fury. "Richard, are you seriously going to defend this attack? This child just humiliated me in front of everyone we know." "And what were you doing to me?" Richard asked, his voice gaining strength. "What have you been doing to me for the past 3 years?" The question hung in the air like smoke, visible and toxic. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she processed the unexpected challenge to her authority. Around them, the restaurant had fallen silent again, the kind of breathless quiet that precedes either violence or revelation. "I was having a conversation," Victoria said finally, her voice defensive for the first time that evening. "We were discussing social obligations." "You were performing," Richard corrected, his calm tone making the words more devastating than any shout. "You were using my disability as entertainment for your audience, and a child could see that what you were doing was wrong." Emma looked up at Richard, her brown eyes bright with tears she didn't fully understand. She had acted on instinct, responding to an injustice that her young heart couldn't tolerate. But now the adult world was closing in around her with its complications and consequences. Sarah pulled Emma closer, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear. "Please, Mrs. Harrison, she's just a little girl. She doesn't understand the situation. I'll take her home immediately, and I promise it won't happen again." "No," said a voice from across the restaurant. The word came from Harold Weatherby, who had risen from his table near the windows. His distinguished grey hair caught the light from the chandeliers as he walked toward the Harrison table, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think you should apologize." Margaret Weatherby gasped audibly, her fan fluttering like a startled bird. "Harold, what are you saying?" Harold ignored his wife's shock, focusing instead on Richard and the small girl who had somehow become the center of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. "I've been watching this performance for 10 minutes, he said, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older principles. "And I'm ashamed that it took a child to say what the rest of us were too cowardly to voice." "Harold, please," Margaret began, but her husband held up a hand for silence. "No, Margaret, I've listened to enough." He looked directly at Victoria, who was still dripping champagne and righteous indignation. "Mrs. Harrison, your behavior toward your husband has been deplorable. That child showed more courage and moral clarity than this entire room of adults." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Her carefully constructed world of social dominance was cracking before her eyes, challenged by a 7-year-old's simple sense of right and wrong, and now an elder statesman's public rebuke. Other diners began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Ashfords whispered urgently to each other, while the Blackwells stared openly at the unfolding drama. This was no longer entertainment. It was a reckoning that made everyone question their own complicity in the evening's cruelties. "This is ridiculous," Victoria sputtered, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You're all being ridiculous. I was simply having a private conversation with my husband." "Nothing about that conversation was private," said another voice. Dr. Patricia Chen, a prominent neurologist who had been dining quietly with her wife in the corner, stood and walked toward the group. "And nothing about it was acceptable. I've worked with disabled patients for 20 years, and what I witnessed here tonight was abuse, plain and simple." Victoria's face went white beneath her streaked makeup. The social support system she had always relied upon was crumbling in real time, replaced by something she had never encountered before: accountability. "Richard," she said, turning to her husband with desperation creeping into her voice, "tell them. Tell them they're overreacting. Tell them about our marriage, our life together." Richard Harrison looked at his wife for a long moment, seeing her perhaps for the first time in years without the filters of obligation and habit. Then he turned his attention to Emma, who was still clutching her mother's hand with the bewildered courage of childhood. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice directed at the little girl. "Thank you for having the bravery that I've lost." Emma smiled tentatively, still not entirely sure what was happening, but sensing that the nice man wasn't angry with her. "My mama says mean people need to learn to be nice," she said softly. "Maybe she just needs practice." The simple wisdom of the statement sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Even Victoria seemed momentarily stunned by the gentle directness of it, her anger faltering in the face of such uncomplicated grace. Pierre cleared his throat nervously, clearly struggling with competing loyalties and social pressures. "Perhaps," he suggested carefully, "we might all benefit from taking a moment to—" "No," Richard said firmly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "No more moments, no more pretending, no more performances." He looked directly at Pierre. "Mrs. Martinez was protecting her daughter, who was protecting me. If anyone should be removed from this restaurant, it's my wife." Victoria gasped, as if she had been physically struck. "Richard, you can't be serious. These people are nobody. They're staff. They're human beings," Richard interrupted, his quiet authority finally matching his business reputation, "which is apparently more than some of our circle can claim." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread throughout the dining room. Conversations at other tables had stopped entirely, and even the kitchen staff had gathered near the service doors to witness this unprecedented upheaval of the social order. Emma looked up at her mother, confused by the tears on Sarah's face, but sensing that something important was happening. "Are we in trouble, Mama?" she whispered. Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level, smoothing back Emma's dark hair with gentle fingers. "No, Mika," she said softly. "I think maybe, for the first time in a long time, we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Dr. Chen approached Emma with the careful respect of someone who understood that children often possessed wisdom that adults had forgotten. "That was very brave, what you did," she told Emma seriously. "Sometimes grown-ups forget how to stand up for what's right. You reminded us." Emma nodded solemnly, still not entirely sure what she had accomplished, but beginning to understand that it was important. "The lady was being mean," she said simply. "Someone had to stop her." Harold Weatherby chuckled, a sound that seemed to break some of the tension in the room. "From the mouths of babes," he murmured, then looked at Pierre. "I think I speak for several of us when I say that Mrs. Martinez and her daughter have our complete support. Any establishment that would punish such courage doesn't deserve our patronage." Margaret Weatherby looked mortified, but several other diners nodded agreement. Dr. Chen smiled approvingly, and even some of the younger society members began to murmur support. Victoria's social empire was crumbling in real time, demolished by a 7-year-old's moral clarity and the courage it had inspired in others. Richard began to wheel his chair backward from the table, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "Victoria, I think it's time we discuss some changes in our arrangement. Perhaps it would be best if you found your own way home tonight." Victoria's face cycled through shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice losing its commanding edge. "Richard, think about what you're saying. Think about our position, our reputation." "I'm thinking about our humanity," Richard replied calmly. "Or rather, what's left of it." He looked at Sarah, who was still kneeling beside Emma. "Mrs. Martinez, would you and Emma do me the honor of joining me for dinner? I believe I owe you both a proper meal and a proper conversation." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but Emma clapped her hands together with delight. "Can we, Mama? Can we have dinner with the nice man?" Sarah looked around the elegant dining room at the faces of Manhattan's elite, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. For the first time in her 8 months at Le Petit Manhattan, she felt like she truly belonged in this space. "We would be honored," she said softly, rising to her feet with Emma's hand firmly in hers. Victoria stood alone beside the table, water still dripping from her hair, her carefully constructed world of social dominance lying in ruins around her feet. The other diners had turned their attention to Richard, Sarah, and Emma, leaving her isolated in a way she had never experienced before. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She gathered what remained of her dignity and swept from the restaurant, her exit far less majestic than her entrance had been. Pierre, sensing that the social winds had shifted permanently, gestured toward a quiet table near the windows. "Perhaps you would prefer a table with a view," he suggested, his deference now directed toward the unlikely trio who had somehow rewritten the rules of his establishment in the span of 20 minutes. As Richard, Sarah, and Emma settled at their new table, the normal sounds of dinner conversation began to resume throughout the restaurant. But something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of Le Petit Manhattan. The unspoken rules of social hierarchy had been challenged by the most unlikely of revolutionaries, and the echo of Emma's simple courage would resonate through Manhattan's elite circles for years to come. Emma picked up her crayons again, now seated at a real table with real crystal glasses that caught the light like captured rainbows. She began to color a new picture, this one showing 3 people sitting together at a table smiling. "What are you drawing?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "A story with a better ending," Emma replied seriously, not looking up from her work. "Mama says every story can have a better ending if people are brave enough to change it." Richard smiled, feeling something inside his chest loosen for the first time in years. Perhaps the little girl was right, perhaps courage was contagious, and perhaps the most important revolutions began with the smallest acts of defiance against cruelty. As the evening continued, word of the incident spread through Manhattan's social networks like wildfire. By morning, The story would be discussed in boardrooms and charity galas, in private clubs and society columns. Some would condemn Richard's public rejection of his wife. Others would celebrate Emma's courage, but none would be able to ignore the questions the evening had raised about power, privilege, and basic human decency. The Harrison Foundation would announce new initiatives within the month, focused not just on accessibility, but on creating spaces where dignity was the only admission requirement. Sarah Martinez would find herself appointed as the Foundation's new Director of Community Outreach, bringing her unique perspective to the fight for social justice. And Emma would return to school with a story about how sometimes, when grown-ups forget how to be good to each other, children have to remind them. Victoria Harrison would fade from Manhattan society with surprising speed, her influence evaporating like champagne bubbles. Some said she moved to the West Coast, others claimed she'd retired to Europe. But most of Manhattan's elite simply stopped mentioning her name, as if she had never existed at all. But in Le Petit Manhattan, and in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it, the memory of a 7-year-old girl's courage would endure. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the smallest acts of justice, and sometimes it takes a child to remind adults what it means to be human.